Thanks. Well, first, I'm really honored to be talking to you. I wish I was there in person. Ireland is one of the countries that I've wanted to go to for a long time. I've, I've given speeches in England and Scotland and all over Europe and Australia and lots of other places, but I've always wanted to come to Ireland, partly because many of my relatives, early relatives, are from Ireland. But maybe someday after the COVID goes away, I'll be able to do that. First, my brother is a teacher. He's a high school teacher in Eureka, California. And I've always told him that I think that his work is sacred work in the broadest sense of that word. And that so much of the power in our culture or cultures is wielded by teachers. For parents, the two most influential people, I think, in their lives are their pediatrician and their teacher, their children's teachers. This means, I think, that both pediatricians and teachers can give great gifts to children, not only now, but future generations in terms of place-based learning, in terms of connecting to the natural world. In the United States, pediatricians, for instance, who are very trusted by parents. I gave the keynote speech about 10 years ago to the American Academy of Pediatrics, their national conference, and there was about 5,000 pediatricians and pediatric nurse practitioners and others in the audience. And I challenged them. First off, I must say I was very surprised to be asked to do that. I'd written a book about nature deficit disorder. I mean, really, nature deficit disorder. I was careful to say that that is not a medical diagnosis. Maybe it should be, but it's a way to talk about this thing that's been happening that we don't have a real language, or at least until that book came out, we didn't really have a language to talk about it with. So I was surprised when they asked me to speak. The reception is far better than I had even hoped. And many of them went back and they started prescribing nature, literally writing nature prescriptions. There's a guy, one of the doctors, Robert Czar in Washington, D.C., went back to Washington, D.C., and he began to write nature prescriptions. In any case, Robert Czar organized all the other pediatricians in Washington, D.C., and they not only started writing these prescriptions, but they organized themselves and created a database of all of the open spaces, all of the parks in Washington, D.C. And so that they could not only write the prescription, but they could tell people exactly where to go, or that there was a park a block and a half from their house. I think that teachers can do something like that, and many already are. They're often doing it on their own campuses. The number of nature-placed preschools in the United States has grown, as of 3 years ago, 500% just in the previous, I think, 5 years. The number has skyrocketed since then. I don't know what the latest number is, but that is catching on here. Now, that has been done for a long time in Scotland and Ireland, I believe, and in Europe. That is spreading now in the United States. And we've learned that from you. So much of this happens on the campus itself, but increasingly, particularly right now, we're wondering what can happen beyond the campus of the school. Place-based education obviously focuses on not just the campus, but the community around the campus. It focuses on where we are and where those children are. Right now with COVID, we're being drawn indoors. And as many of you know, I assume this is happening in Ireland. A lot of teaching is being done by Skype. I mentioned my brother, by the way. He's a high school teacher and he hates technology. And he told me the other day that when he does Zoom with his students, the school keeps having to call him because he forgets he's doing it. He wanders off. So he's like, Mike, go back to your computer. I hope none of you do that. So what's happened, oddly, is even as we've been pulled back into our houses, I think, talking to Grania, that this is true in Ireland too. Paradoxically, there's been a greater awareness of the need for nature after COVID, after the lockdowns, than there was before. Suddenly, we really value nature more than we did, possibly because you don't know what you got until it's gone, until you don't have the access to the parks. But also people have a deep need for nature connection right now. Intuitively, we know that helps our mental health. The studies that have been done, both on physical health, mental health, and cognitive functioning, really are very young. This topic of how nature affects child development and human development was virtually ignored by the academic world until about 15 or around 18 years ago. And then a few pioneers started. There had been some work on this. But when I wrote Last Child in the Woods, I could find about 60 studies that were reputable enough that I could cite those in that book, which came out in 2005. Children Nature Network has a site on it, on its website, has a research library that any of you can go to for free and see the abstracts for as many of the studies as we've been able to find on the impact of child development on education, on cognitive development, on health, even on social connection. It's gone from about 60 studies to over 1,000 studies since 2005. And these studies are still coming in, and we're still doing abstracts of them. They're independently done, first by folks at Yale that helped us, and now by the University of Minnesota. And we're very conservative about what we post. Many of those studies, as you probably know, are correlative, not causal. They show a correlation, and that is, it's preferable that you show a direct cause. It's very hard to do studies that show a direct cause just from nature's influence, because how do you define nature? That's one of the problems, is science has a hard time defining nature, and I understand that. But now we're starting to see longitudinal studies. In 2005, in the 2000s, few people had thought to ask that question 30 years ago. So we don't have longitudinal studies that go back a long way about how much time kids spend outdoors and all of that, or the influence on them. But it's very rare for such a large body of correlative evidence to point in one direction. And these studies, almost all of them point in that direction. We have yet to see a study that undermines the notion that exposure to nature improves cognitive functioning, mental health, psychological health, a sense of connection to community, environmental consciousness or ethics. All of those are improved by spending more time in the natural world. How to apply all of that is a different question. And there's a lot of experimentation. I'm very curious when we get into the discussion period about some of the experimentation going on in Ireland. I think there's a lot that the United States can learn, obviously, these days from you. But COVID has had this ironic effect. The other day, I posted a question on Facebook. I said, how many of you are finding for your kids or yourself that other animals, your pets or wild animals, are helping you get through this? The responses really poured in, and many of them were fascinating. And again, people said that they basically had not looked out their window very much at that tree before they had to stay indoors. And now they were looking, now they were very aware of the animals, the wild animals that go through their yards. They were very aware of how they felt when that coyote went through their neighborhood and they saw it and it changed them in some way. They were very aware suddenly that there was a lot of nature nearby, that you don't have to go to Yosemite or the Grand Canyon or somewhere, a great national park to find nature. It's where you live. Even in the densest urban neighborhoods, you can find it. Even if it's the ledge under the windows across the street where a raptor is making its nest. And what people report again and again is that they feel better. They feel better when they connect to nature, even if it's only visually through their window. It calms them. It centers them. And their children prefer it to screens. I heard that again and again. Obviously, we spend a lot of time on our screens, and I'm not one of the folks who says that technology is terrible. There's a kind of mantra or bumper sticker idea in one of my books, The Nature Principle. And the notion is the more high-tech our lives become, the more nature we need. It's an equation. The studies on attention retention that have looked at attention deficit disorder and others not only show that more nature exposure reduces the symptoms of attention deficit disorder in kids and adults, but it shows that if we have spent a lot of time looking at a screen, doing close work, the best way to lift that sense of being burned out by that work, the best way to do that is to pay a different kind of attention, to go outside, particularly in nature, that the functions, our neurological functions, return to something like normal far quicker if we do that. That's the best way to recuperate from burnout from too much computer use. So what that means is our lives are going to get more technological. We're finding that out right now when we spend so much time on Zoom, as I am right now, and you are too. But in order to deal with that, we have to not only do the amount of nature connection we already do, we have to up the game. We have to have a lot more nature connection to keep up with that technological exposure. That's particularly true for kids. So I often talk about what I call the hybrid mind when I talk to teachers. The hybrid mind is an effort to find that sense of balance between the technological and the natural, between the virtual and the real. The scientists who look at the human senses no longer talk about 5 senses. They talk conservatively about 9 or 10 human senses. And they all have names. And in fact, some of the scientists talk about as many as 30 human senses or more. The more they look into how we perceive the world, how we come to know the world, the more fascinating it gets and the more complex it gets. Now, indigenous people all over the world have known that for a long time. And now science is starting to catch up with that. We have some of the ability of bats to use echolocation. People who have lost their sight can find their way through dark rooms using just their ears. We have some of the abilities of bloodhounds to track through the woods. One study was done with college students, of course, as the guinea pigs, and they put blindfolds on the college students and they plugged their ears. They got down on their hands and knees and they followed a trail of chocolate, of course, chocolate through the woods. And they were able to follow it for a long way. And the people doing the studies, the scientists doing the study, remarked on something they didn't expect. They said the students who were tracking just with their noses, were doing something that animals who make their living with their noses all do. They were zigzagging through the woods following that scent trail. This is part of who we are. It's still in us. Uh, Studies were done, military studies in the United States and Afghanistan and Iraq, looking at why is it that some soldiers know that there's something down that alleyway and they shouldn't go down that alleyway right now. And they found that some soldiers really do know that. In the past, we've called that the sixth sense. What it probably is um, a more full use of the senses, of more of our senses than we know we have. They found the soldiers who can do this tend to come from two places when they grew up. One was inner city neighborhoods, and they were looking at American soldiers. The other place was rural areas. They grew up on farms. They grew up connected to nature. In both of those cases, you kind of have to know what's going on around you. You have to know what's behind you. You have to know your senses are much more acutely honed when you grow up in those two places. Certainly more than they are honed when you're looking at the computer all day. The hybrid mind, I define this, the easiest way to describe that is I met a guy who teaches people how to become the pilots of cruise ships. We'll see if that industry is still around in a few months. But we do need a few good pilots for cruise ships. And he told me he gets two kinds of students. One kind grew up on couches playing video games in front of screens, their computers and their iPhones and all that before iPhones. And he said that those students have a talent and abilities that I need on my ships. I've got a lot of electronics on my ships. He said the other kind of student grew up more outside. Maybe their parents did a lot of backpacking. Maybe they grew up on a farm. Whatever it was, those students had grown up more outside and less in the screen. He said, those kind of students also have skills and abilities I need. He said, that kind of student can actually tell where the ship is. He wasn't being facetious. He was being literal. He says, they can sense when the ship is too close to the dock. They have a better sense of direction. They have a better spatial sense of where they are in the world. And his theory, and I think there's research that really backs this up, is that for the kids who grew up on couches almost entirely consumed by the screen, their spatial senses had atrophied or never had a chance to grow. The spatial senses of the people who grew up outside had been nurtured. The next thing he said was the most interesting. He said his ideal student would be a student who has both sets of abilities, both the set of abilities that comes from the virtual world and the set of abilities that comes from the real world. I think that that should be one of the central objectives of education. It's not talked very much about in the United States, the need for that balance. In fact, the tech companies, certainly in the United States, are the ones who control the debate about the future of schools. Whenever people talk about future schools, they always talk about more computers. They talk about wall-sized computer screens. So they talk about kids plugged in ways that we can't even imagine. And kids being monitored all the time by computers, every stroke they do with their pencil, etc. I don't know about you, but that kind of monitoring seems kind of creepy to me. And the reason when we think of the future of schools in the United States that way is because the tech companies control the debate. They have product to move. And they have money to give to school districts. And school districts tend to make the easiest decision. There's this myth that if you just throw a lot of computers at kids, they'll get smarter. And there's very little research to support that. There's a lot of research that says that recess raises test scores. Getting outside now, there's more research now, just in the last few years. 700 schools in Massachusetts studied the schools that had greened themselves. And by that, I mean, not solar panels, I mean natural play spaces at the school, but also getting kids out through place-based education into the nature around the school. in those schools in Massachusetts, 700 schools, the ones that had been green, the kids did better on standardized test scores than the kids that were in the typical school. And yet we keep believing this myth that if we only, at least in the United States, and I hope that's not happening there, that if only we lengthen the school day, increase the number of school hours, take recess away from kids, and that's been happening for at least a decade in the United States. When we know it, recess, decades of research so that getting kids outdoors raises test scores. Finland leads the world most often in science and math testing, and they get their kids out many times during the day. It's woven into the way they approach education. One of the ironies is that so many of the tech leaders in Silicon Valley know this, and their kids are in Waldorf schools often. Their kids are in independent schools where the kids go outdoors. Their kids are not staring at screens all day in the schools. And in fact, many of these tech leaders have cabins up in the mountains where they literally go to unplug and reboot themselves. They know this, but they don't talk about it. And the reason is they have product to move. This is also one of the reasons why, until recently, there's been so little research on the effect of nature exposure, nature connection to child development, human development. One, as I mentioned, is science has a hard time defining nature. I understand that. For the new book that I just wrote, or was just published, I found that science has at least 124 definitions of life. Science can't decide what's actually alive now. I understand that. These are complicated things. But the other reason that there is so little research on this until recently is, where does the money come from? Where do the grants come from? Who funds the research? Increasingly in the United States, I hope this isn't true in Ireland, much of the research is supported by commercial sources. That's one of the reasons, what toy can you sell? What pill can you sell? That determines often what questions you ask. Now, as I say, there are pioneering schools, pioneering teachers. There has been a movement that has been growing now. I often call it the Children in Nature Network, but I'm sorry, the Children in Nature Network is the nonprofit that grew out of Last Child in the Woods. That's at childrenandnature.org. And I suggest you go look at it and look at the research library. It'll be really helpful to you when you make a case. But this movement has emerged and it's growing fast. I mentioned pediatricians. Urban planners are now paying attention to this. In the United States, Children Nature Network is a partner with the National League of Cities. The National League of Cities has 18,000 mayors representing municipalities all over the United States. And we're now developing pilot cities around the United States to do three things. One is to ask, what is a nature-rich city? What does it mean for a city to be good at connecting families to the natural world in the city? The second question is, how do we measure that over time, the effect of that on the people who live in the cities? And the third is, how do we train future mayors to do that? So urban planners now, architects are now looking increasingly at biophilic architecture. Biophilia is love of life. E.O. Wilson at Harvard decades ago came up with his biophilia hypothesis. That hypothesis has fueled a lot of the research. And basically the theory is that human beings are hardwired genetically to have an affiliation with the rest of nature. We need it. And when we don't get it, we don't do so well. So this movement has been growing. Parents are involved with it. Teachers are involved with it. Whenever I speak around the US, and when I was speaking, when I was getting on airplanes and overseas, I'm always amazed at the teachers who come up to me and they say, I've been getting my kids outdoors, for 10 years. And I don't care what the principal says, I'm going to keep doing it because I see the impact it has on my students, on their ability to think, their ability to create, and most importantly, their ability to feel fully alive. I think that is the umbrella under which all of this discussion fits. Yes, there are lots of studies now about physical and mental health and cognitive functioning. But those are under the umbrella of simply being more alive. When you think about it, remember I mentioned all those 30 senses, possibly as many as 30 or more senses. When you're spending most of your life doing what we're doing right now, staring at a screen, when we created environments for our kids in our schools that they just stare at the screen hour after hour and then take tests hour after. And when we create environments for ourselves that we do that, and I confess, I'm guilty of that. I spend way too much time at the screen. What have we done by creating those environments and keeping kids and ourselves in those environments too long every day? When people are in those environments, kids or adults, we spend an enormous amount of energy pushing away as many of those 30 or more human senses as we can, so we can use 2 senses to go allegedly anywhere in the world through the internet. If we're spending all that energy turning off our senses, isn't that the very definition of being less alive? Now, what parent wants their child to be less alive? What teacher wants their students to be less alive? The point of education, the point of all of this, shouldn't be whether or not, or only whether or not you get the right answer on the test. It should be, do you feel, are you more alive? And I think that question has been lost in much of education in the United States. I hope Ireland is different. Now, the people who focus on place-based education have known this a long time. I'm not telling you anything you don't already know. And that's one of the reasons why I believe that you're doing sacred work. You really are at the forefront of teaching us, teaching the rest of us, the importance of place. When I was writing another book, Nature Principle, and that was more about adults and nature deficit disorder, more about creating a society, I asked, what would it look like if a society people spent as much time in the natural world as they did in the virtual world? What would it be? What would it feel like in that city, in that society? What would it feel like if our cities were engines of biodiversity, not the enemy? I think they can be. There's a lot of great ideas about how to do that. Biophilic architecture is one of them, in which you weave nature into the workplace, into the school, into a whole city. You make that whole city nature rich. The workplaces where biophilic architecture has been used, the productivity goes up, sick time goes down, turnover gets better. What if whole cities could be like that? What if whole schools could be? What if our house could be like that? One of the chapters I wrote was about my own county in San Diego County in California. I pointed out that I had lived here for a long time. I moved here from Kansas in 1971 out of college. I had a real struggle connecting to this place. I didn't really want to be here. It's a long story. But it looked so strange. There were these trees from Mars everywhere. It didn't look like I wasn't in Kansas anymore. But over time, as I got to know the backcountry, for instance, where I now live, the mountains at 4,200 feet, which has mountain lions, uh, filled with life. I'll go for a walk out here and I'll see 20, 30 deer. I walk about 5 miles a day and I'll see them. As I got to know my place better, I realized how rich this. And then I learned finally that San Diego County has more biodiversity than any county in the lower 48 states. Nobody knows that here, virtually. They think of San Diego, they think of the beaches and the zoo, and that's about it. And everything else is kind of like freeways and ATM machines. And great weather. And so I was asked to lunch one time by the head of the Natural History Museum here in San Diego. And he said they're planning the next 10 years and what theme should they use? And I suggested, what if this bioregion, which is recognized, that I live in, that is recognized by the UN as a hotspot for biodiversity, what if we named it? What if we put that on the front burner of the marketing of San Diego to tourists, that this is an amazing place with great biodiversity? What if we geared our schools toward that knowledge? What if libraries had special sections just on this place? And the key would be to name it. Name it something romantic. I don't know, Pandora or something, or a Kumeyaay name, people who lived here originally and still do. What if we named it and made it part of our DNA, our place DNA? It would have an enormously good effect, I think, on psychological health in San Diego. One of the characteristics of Southern California is people have a hard time getting attached to it in their heart. Once you're attached to a place, it begins to nurture you more. Wendell Berry has a saying, a great writer. He says, you can't know who you are until you know where you are. Again, that's what you as teachers do with your students. And we have a lot to learn from you, all of us. So I'll stop there and maybe we still have some time for questions. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Richard. That was fantastic. I really, really enjoyed that. We have plenty of time for questions, so I hope you're up to the task. Okay. What I might do just before I put a few questions to you is I might just say hello from a few people that they've put in here. So we have Brendan Dunford, our very dear director. Hello from Boston Tubber in the East Burren. Jonathan Angus, hello from Mount Shannon in County Clare. Hi from Cara Finn, that's Karen Van Dorp. Tom Marta to everyone, hi from Lochray. Joe Gadden, hello from Kildare. Hi from Inishowen and Rivers Trust in Donegal, that's Claire Thompson. Hi from a very wet Dublin, Patricia Byrne. Hi from Edinburgh, Scotland, that's Liga Dunn. So we have a huge, I have so many names here, so I'm not going to read out all of them, but just to kind of acknowledge all the people we have that have tuned in tonight. I think we have 167 participants here this evening, so that is fantastic. Kasia Timo, greetings from Poland. So we have some international and some Irish national. I really enjoyed your talk, Richard, and I especially enjoyed when you spoke about the CEOs of Silicon Valley, because I feel like that's a mantra I repeat often. You know, Bill Gates and Steve Jobs don't give their kids iPads, you know, and that's important and it's significant. And I think there is a real push in schools to include ICT in most lessons in some way, and I have to question it. I'm not against technology. I think it's fantastic, but I just appreciate that sentiment. And how do you think that we can kind of push that forward? How can we kind of, without seeming like Luddites or, you know, anti-technology, how do we go against the tide a little bit in terms of the education sector?
I think one thing is to come up with different ways to deal with the tech. One of the books that I did is called Vitamin N, and it's one of those books, 500 things you can do, your family, your community can do to connect to the natural world. I hate those kind of books. But after a while, I realized that I was receiving so many good ideas from people that it would be a shame to just keep those to myself. So I shared those in those books. There's a whole section in Vitamin N about using technology. And there are ideas like one idea is bracketing. And that's where if you take kids into nature, at the beginning of the experience, you say, everybody get on your iPhones. You know, connect to your friends, text, get online, do what you want to do, play a game, it's okay for a while, and then leave them in the car. And now we're going to go on our nature adventure. When we get back, you can do it again. So it's kind of like bracketing, where when you take pictures the way we used to, where you take a lot on one side, you make sure you have that one picture that's good. You know, there are a lot of techniques to doing this. And I actually think that obviously some technology is great. I'm a real fan of digital photography. I take my camera everywhere outdoors. I post my pictures of the deer, and I've got one, I got it on a trail cam right outside this window of a mountain lion in our yard the other night. And I put that on Facebook. I brought it in, the chip from, you know, and you put it in there, you look what you got that night. My wife claims I screamed. I didn't scream, but I was very excited to see a mountain lion on our property. So taking digital pictures is great. I wrote a piece once about, I had my camera, and I realized over time when I use my digital camera, I take fewer pictures from the big horizon, and I get more and more granular. I start taking pictures of moss on rocks and of bark on trees. And one of the pictures was this really beautiful, this bark on a pine tree, all these lines. I got it home and I looked at it the first time, oh, that's pretty. Then I looked at it closer, and there was an eye looking at me in between the crevices of the bark, a pretty big eye. So I posted it on my blog, and I asked, what is that? And I got a lot of answers. People thought I was silly. It wasn't anything there. Some people, others had all kinds of theories. It was a lizard, you know, lots of things. But one boy, I think he was about 11, he wrote in and he said, it's obvious, it's a dragon. I said, I'm with you. It's a dragon. So, you know, digital photography is a way to use technology that I think is helpful. Binoculars that's technology. So it all depends on how we use it. I have an idea, which in one of the books I call, it's kind of a tech litmus test. The test of whether the technology is good when you take it outdoors is, how long does it take you to look up from it, to look away from the screen? If you're still looking at that screen 5 minutes later, that's not a great piece of technology for you most of the time, if you're just locked into that. If it's brief and the rest of the time you're using your senses and you're in the world, then I think that's great.
Absolutely. And I suppose there's, you know, with modern social media, there's this renewed appreciation for green and blue spaces in order to, you know, to capture that and to put it on your feed. But you're right. I think, you know, photography and using technology well is so important, and so vital for, you know, for conservation in general. So yeah, really good. Thanks a million. Kate, do you have any questions?
I was just I mean, coming back to the technology again, Richard, when you were talking about, you know, the ship's pilots and things, and how they like having people that are good at technology but people that grow up in nature, is there a balance? Could you ever you know, have the nature and the technology, and what would that balance actually be?
Well, I think place-based education is seeking that balance. I think it's possible. I think that equation I mentioned, which is the more high-tech our lives become, the more nature we need, that's a budgeting question. You know, that's budgeting of time and money, whether it's for a family or a school. I think we can start there to measure that budgeting. If we're, you know, I often say that for every dollar in education that's spent on the virtual, we need to spend at least another dollar on the real. And if we're doing that, the kids will be fine. But when that begins to swing, and you can see that in the budget, literally, so when that begins to swing too far to the technology, it's not so good. And I think a case could be made when you swing too far the other way, that that's not so good, because kids are going to grow up in a technological world.
Sorry, I was sneaking and getting my question in there, and we do have questions from some other people that are listening in. So I'll give you a couple of these other questions now from different people, and see what you think of those. So right from the beginning, so from Courtney, she says, Richard, do you have any suggestions for implementing nature-based learning in an after-school program? I'm an assistant coordinator for an after-school program, and currently we have a greenhouse. So I think they're kind of looking for, yeah.
That's a great idea. Um, well, there's so many ideas. I don't really know where to start. I mean, there's a whole section in Vitamin N with idea after idea. One of the things I would recommend, you know, Vitamin N costs money, but going to the Children Nature Network site on the web is free. And there are blogs by people from all over the world, teachers, who have changed their schools. That have sent us pieces about how they did that and what they did and the effect it had. There's an aggregate of news from all over the world of schools and other institutions that have dedicated themselves to connecting kids to nature. So there are a lot of examples of that online, more than I can even, you know, scrape the surface of here. Kate, I can't hear you. You're muted again.
It's the technology. It kills me, Richard. I've got another question here as well. So it's from Diamet, and he is saying, hi, Richard, should nature therapy be an integral part of a medical doctor's university training curriculum? There's a big question for you.
Well, that's a good question. I think so. I mean, the eco-psychology is growing fast. Not only of medical training, but of teacher training. One of the goals that we have in the United States, and I don't know about Ireland, I don't know if this is part of teacher training in Ireland, but it's not in the United States. There are a couple programs at a couple universities that actually teach teachers how to take kids outdoors to learn and how to create learning environments, natural learning environments. But that's it. And I think this is fundamental to education. It should be in the teaching colleges. One of the issues is that you have a whole generation of teachers, or more than one generation now, that spent very little time outdoors in nature when they were kids, because they're part of the nature deficit generation, now plural generations. Not only that, but the messages they get from media, my profession, from school districts, from parents, from lawyers, this being a very litigious society, is to be afraid to take the kids outdoors. Stranger danger is one of the biggest issues in the United States in terms of forcing parents to raise their kids under virtual protective house arrest. We're terribly afraid of strangers in the United States. Again, I don't know how true that is in Ireland. But the reality is, when you look at the real statistics, not in every neighborhood, but most neighborhoods, it's a lot safer than we think it is. The actual rate of violent crime toward children outside the home has been going down for decades. What's been going up is the amount of coverage that a few cases, relatively few tragic cases, get covered in the media. And so there's a lot of fear. There have to be ways to get over that. Teachers have to be taught how to deal with this, how to go outside, how to take their kids outside, how to deal with the parents who don't want their kids to get their shoes muddy. All of that. And the same is true, as your questioner asked, I think, for the medical profession. There is now a movement among pediatricians in the American Academy of Pediatrics to begin to recognize at a much deeper level the value of nature as a prescriptive medicine. I hesitate to call it medicine, but it is one of the few things. The head of the University of California, Riverside Medical School told me is that nature experience is one of the few things that works well both for prevention and for therapy. There's very few things that do that. So I agree with the questioner's premise.
That's great. Courtney Pepino, who also asked the first question, also asked, could you please share links to research on multiple senses? So I assume that research is in the Children and Nature Network website. So I'll link that again, and I'll put that in the chat in a moment. Brendan Dunford asks, Richard, biodiversity is obviously a key concern. To what extent do you feel other aspects of place are important in making the connection? For example, cultural heritage, etc. And I think this is something we talked about yesterday, and I think you've touched on it with the San Diego, your connection to San Diego. And I do think in Ireland, you know, place names are really important. They really kind of draw people into a place and root them in a place. So maybe you could talk a little bit more on your experience of that.
There's a fellow, I think in Wales, and I'm sorry, I can't remember his name. We talked about this yesterday, who wrote a book called The Children's Fire that I gave a blurb to. And he basically makes the case that we all come from indigenous people. That every culture, if you go back far enough, you'll find indigenous thinking. And increasingly in the United States, and I wrote about this quite a bit in the new book, which I'm shamelessly, well, it's this side, I'm shamelessly promoting my books. Two of the 4 books I've written about this behind me. But in Our Wild Calling, I talk about this quite a bit, that indigenous knowledge is now being valued more by education in the United States than it's ever been. It's still not nearly enough. There is indigenous knowledge, although it's called different things in Ireland and other places as well. And it's deeply rooted in history and prehistory and place. I'd like to talk for a second too about this new book, which I've focused on. It's the hardest book that I've done. I've written 10 books. This one was the hardest. And it's about our relationship with other animals. Other animals are part of our place. They're our fellow travelers on this planet. They are part of biodiversity, obviously. Almost all of the research that's been done on the benefits of nature has been done on green space. Now, there's an assumption made in a lot of this research that there are animals in that green space. But very little specifically has been done on wild animals. There's been quite a bit done on therapy animals, on domestic animals used for animal-assisted therapy and all of that. We know that dogs help us live longer. There's a lot more known about our pets now, our companion animals. But wild animals are different. We've not really looked at that. And I make the case in this book that not only are animals, particularly wild animals, fundamental to our place, and the key to biodiversity, obviously, but they're fundamental to who we are. They're fundamental to our health. They're fundamental to us feeling more alive. Again, this is one of the ironies of COVID. People are looking out their windows now and they're seeing birds they've never seen before. Now, they were there before, but now they're seeing them for the first time because they realize how those birds make them feel. In cities, there's been a lot of reporting about suddenly wild animals are showing up on the street, coyotes walking down the middle, lions walking down the middle of the street, all that. I don't know about the lions, but although here we have them, mountain lions. But the irony is that, yes, some of those animals, wild animals, have arrived because people have gone inside their houses, and those animals have not been in the cities before. But most of them were already there. I have a chapter in here called The Betweens. It's about the wild animals that have been moving into cities for a long time as we've moved out into their territory. They're often neophilic animals. That means they're attracted to the new. It's a particular kind of animal. Crows, coyotes, foxes, raccoons, of course, and bears, increasingly. They're attracted to the new. They're the vanguard of the animals that come into our cities and make themselves at home. The reason people are just now noticing those is because before we went inside, those animals were asleep when we were awake. Those animals were often diurnal animals, daytime dwellers, before they came into the city, but they became nocturnal when they came into our cities. They adapted to us. And so we don't see them much. They become shyer. In a strange sense, they become gentler when they come into our cities, our neighborhoods, and live with us. So now people are noticing that. And they're noticing how it makes them feel. There's a whole study of awe, as many of you know. What does awe do to us? What does awe do to our psychological well-being, our ability to pay attention to detail, ability to stop time long enough to notice? That's what awe is about. A sense of awe and wonder happens usually when two things occur. One is we step outside of our comfort zone. The other thing is when it feels slightly dangerous. I never say that nature is safe. In fact, it's one of its attractions. But staying indoors and growing up on couches is also unsafe. So this sense of awe, I think, is fundamental to education. It's fundamental to our sense of being alive. It's fundamental to exciting and enlivening our senses. And it's fundamental for the protection of the wildlife around us, as well as the green spaces around us. When we feel that, we want to protect that. We value that. And I want to speak for a second about this. And this has a lot. I have a long chapter in this book, in Our Wild Calling, about education. First, let me tell you something. I'm not talking about the detailed science of studying animals. That's hugely important. But about something else in the book. Now I'll tell you a couple of brief stories to illustrate that. One is the story of a dog and a boy. A woman in Toronto told me she walked into her living room and her 6-year-old boy was stretched out on the carpet with their dog, whose name was Jack, big dog. They're both laying there. And her son had his arm around his dog. And she heard her son say, "Mommy, I don't have a heart anymore." And she says, "What are you saying?" And without looking up, her son said, "My heart is in Jack." That permeability that we feel with people, we also feel with animals. Most readily, we feel that with our companion animals. But we also feel that with wild animals, if we pay attention. I have a long story, it's too long to tell here, about a famous oceanographer, at least among oceanographers he is, who had an encounter with an octopus that changed his life. Because something happened between him and the octopus when it grabbed him on the bottom of the ocean, and they went up in the spiral of water. And on the way up, they made their, as he says, their non-aggression pact. And it was the eye contact he had with the octopus that changed him. I was on a lake one day in my boat, and I have a very quiet electric motor. I saw on the shore what I thought were two turkey buzzards, turkey vultures. And I wanted to look at them closer, so I went up closer to them, got within 20 feet. And they weren't vultures. They were two giant golden eagles. You don't get within 20 feet of golden eagles very often. And I stayed there. And as I went back and forth very quietly, the eagles did this. They'd lean down and take a bite of the fish they were eating, then look up at me. Lean down, take another bite, and look up at me. And they did that for what seemed like forever. And by forever, I mean that the many stories that were told to me by people about their encounters with wildlife often talked about a set of altered senses, altered states. One of them was that time goes away, stops, or bends. And so you don't know how long that was. To me, it was forever. Another one is a sense of scale. You know, watch an anthill for a while from their perspective, and your sense of scale becomes a Lilliputian, you know, it changes. So they did that for a long time, and I felt something change. Not so much in me, or I can't speak for the eagles. They may have just been wondering if I was edible. But between the eagles and me, there was something. I went back and I told my younger son, who was home from college that weekend, I said, Matthew, I told him about this, and I said, something happened there. Whoever I say I am, I'm not. Whoever I was in those moments is who I actually am. And I don't have the words to explain that. This is beyond human language. This is in a different language, an older language. Story after story after story, and I collected hundreds of them that people told me. Many of these people had never told anybody their story about their encounter with an animal that changed them. That theme came up again and again. So the quest of the book is, what is that? What is that thing that happens? And Martin Buber, the great intellectual, and I always have to be careful not to say Justin Bieber. Martin Buber wrote a great essay called I Am Thou. It was about people. And he said that you and I don't actually exist. What exists is right here. It's between us. It's the relationship. He meant relationship in a deeper way than most of us use that word. He thought of this relationship between two people as a kind of electricity that some people call God. He was talking about people. I was talking to people who were describing that in terms of their encounters with wild animals and their companion animals. So in the book, I call that the habitat of the heart. There are two habitats. One is the physical habitat that we spend a lot of time trying to protect, as we should, for wildlife, for trees. The other habitat is the habitat of the heart. And we spend very little time focusing on that, learning about it, teaching about it, caring for it, nurturing it, building it. If one of those habitats goes, so does the other one. I think this has something to do with the future of environmentalism, which increasingly is about the data. We wonder why people don't take more action. And I consider myself an environmentalist. Data seldom moves people to action. What moves them is emotion. What moves them is their heart. The great social movements that have moved people to action have been the ones about relationship. Civil rights movement, for an example, the Black Lives Matter is about relationships. Gay rights of relationships. Feminism, relationships. we have to now talk about our relationship with nature, our relationship with other animals at the level, in the habitat of the heart. When we begin to do that, the whole discussion becomes deeper. Again, indigenous people have known this for a long time, and they've known the value of storytelling. This isn't just about the data. I remember, well, first I want to say, and I'll get off this topic in a second. One of the things that keeps us from doing this is the fear of anthropomorphism. And there's good reasons to be careful about anthropomorphizing other animals. It kind of takes their animalness away from them, makes them into us. So we do have to be careful about that. But many of the cutting edge biologists and wildlife scientists are beginning to question that. That oceanographer that I mentioned is beginning to question our taboo on anthropomorphism. They don't say we should go back to what is seen as anthropomorphism, but they do say we need to have relationship with other animals. We need to have empathy with them, which is what relationship is about. There's a guy named Gordon Burkhardt. He's a herpetologist and a psychologist in the United States that a few years ago came up with the term, I don't know why I always blank on this, applied anthropomorphism. It's not that. I'll think of it in just a second. Basically, he says this type of anthropomorphism has two steps. One is, he says, if you're going to study a snake, you have to be with the snake. He says the first thing you do is, when you're looking at that snake, you apply in your mind all of the scientific knowledge you know about that snake. What is it that it does with its tongue? That we know through science. The second step is use your imagination. Become the snake. To the degree that your limited human senses and capabilities, become the snake. Have empathy for the snake. Imagine what it would be like to be that snake. That's empathy. He says, if you do both those things, then the likelihood that you will ask the right scientific questions goes way up. I think, and I don't know why I block on this, but practical anthropomorphism, that's not it, applied anthropomorphism. I'll have to look it up in a second. That's why I think this ought to be taught in schools. In the United States, by the time kids who are really good at biology, by the time they get to 6th grade in the United States, that gets beaten out of a lot of kids because it becomes all about the data. Biology becomes math. It's good to study microbiology, but that's not all there is to life. Those kids, and it's interesting, studies have been done of indigenous kids, and the indigenous kids are way ahead of many other demographic groups in the United States on biology in the early grades. They hit 6th grade, and that life is taken away from them in biology by too much data. Again, we need the data, we need the technology, but we also have to tell the stories. We also have to have empathy with that which we study.
Richard, your stories they're beautiful. They build up such a strong connection, I think, with so many people. And looking at the comments and things that people have written in, it's incredible. I think you're touching everybody out there that's listening. So Kira Hinksman has said, powerful stuff, great to hear you acknowledge the sentient non-human beings we share our planet with. I think that kind of sums up most of the comments that have been made. And I think Peter Wooding, I think you've already answered his question with all the information from the research being done and your books, of course. Why do we still not spend more time in nature, and why do we continue to behave in a way which causes climate change? I think you've pretty much kind of covered all of that already, and the way you've done it through stories and connections is just so beautiful. There's another question here now from Brendan Dunford. Richard, one other question, if there is time. To what extent do you think are the facts like names of plants important in connecting people with place? as compared with more exploratory approaches. So play, critical thinking, self-discovery. Lots of teachers are very daunted by not knowing enough, but do they need to know?
That's a great question. I often say about parents that, parents get nervous and they feel like they need to know the name of everything. And I actually think, when you name things, I mentioned naming my bioregion, some romantic name, it actually helps focus on that. I'm not against studying the names of things at all. And I know there's some that question that, but I don't. But you have to add to that, add deeply to that. And parents are very nervous. They have to know everything before they take their kids outdoors and they study it. I said, look, it's better that you not know the names of everything, because when you go out with your kid, then you're both feeling a sense of wonder and mystery. And if you don't know, you learn together. That's the way people learn the best. And the kid will remember that. Won't remember the parent hovering over him or her with a nature flashcards. They're not going to remember that, or maybe they will. But I think you know what I'm saying.
I think from my point of view as both a learner and as an educator, to bring people to outside into the environment, it's just absolutely critical and key. And I think that's what a lot of our program over the next few days are going to talk about. And I do think there's a huge disconnect with, educating our teachers and how to be educators and how to do that. And how to bring nature into the classroom. And Patrick Madden and Des Murta are going to have a presentation on Saturday, and they will be talking a little bit about that. So I think it echoes through, and of course David Sabel on Friday night. But I think personally, from my point of view, you're hitting so many buttons for me, and so I'm just finding it fascinating. And I can see like the chat here is going off. So when we've recorded this session, so we will be able to export the chat and have a proper look at it. But Roisin Geddes says, Richard, this is hugely fascinating, and absolutely you're lighting a torch for us all and what we can actually do for our natural environment and how we can create better educational opportunities for our children. And then I had one other question from Leah Kamaski. Richard, how do we convince local planning programs at county council levels that acknowledging anthropomorphic influence is not the full story? So county council levels, is there kind of local planning offices, so the kind of regional, the local planners, I suppose, is the best way to say it. Yeah. And
when they're local planners, are you saying urban planning? Is that what you're talking about, or education planning?
I suppose local planners, so talking about going back to the idea of a biophilic architecture. I assume that this is Leah's question, so I assume that's what she's talking about. I know, I think there's a lot of old suburban areas in Ireland that, because they're older areas, have naturally grown up with green leafy spaces and with patch vegetation around them. That's actually in the sort of place I grew up, outside of a city in Cork City. But there are a lot newer developments and roadways and things that are just, there's no corridors or and there's always this siloed thinking of having that intention. And so it's not that the requirement isn't there to so they do try to tick boxes, but how do we convince them to really to take it on board, I suppose?
I think there's more innate interest in this than we assume, because you have to have the conversation to discover how much interest there is. And what happens is that conversation doesn't take place because they're all throwing jargon at each other, right? And that's sometimes, I think, that among attorneys and city planning officials and all of that, that's not by accident that the jargon is beyond us. But when you finally have that discussion on a human level, interesting things happen. What I found again and again in the last 15 years is that it doesn't matter what somebody's politics or religion is. They all want to tell me if they're lucky enough to have had it, about the treehouse they had when they were kids, about their special place in nature that they went when they were kids. And their face changes, their affect changes. They want to go there. They want to tell you about that. The minute you move the discussion to that, about them in their heart, their special place, which is still there, even if the place got torn down. The minute the conversation moves there, no matter how technical the people are, the conversation begins. And the way to get there is to talk about children and nature. Nobody wants to be in the last generation where it's considered natural and expected and even encouraged for kids to go out and lie on their back in the grass and look up through the trees, through the limbs, and watch the clouds move. Nobody wants to be in the last generation. When you open that doorway in people and they start to talk about their special place in nature, all of a sudden, place-based education and natural play areas at schools and changing the neighborhoods, including their neighborhood, and putting wildlife corridors through cities becomes a lot more interesting. It becomes personal. We could do that. We could do that. That's the sense you get from them. Clint Eastwood, of all people, asked me to come to Carmel and meet with the biggest developers in California. This is before the 2008 big recession. I was astonished at how interested the residential developers were in creating neighborhoods that would be designed to connect people to nature. The reason they were so interested is they thought that was an amenity that could be marketed. But we entered that conversation through this thing as, where was your special place in nature when you were a kid? The other aspect of this is, and the COVID may help this conversation. For instance, there is now more discussion about natural play spaces, outdoor learning spaces now than there was before COVID. And the reason is social distancing and the contagion of the coronavirus in indoor places that have bad ventilation. Getting kids outdoors to learn in more natural areas is going to protect their health to a degree, and the teachers' health, and the parents who are visiting. That's a place to start. But also there's urban planners that are now talking about, they're noticing how when people look out their window or they go outside and they want nature so much and it's good for their mental health, they're captive in their houses and they need that tree, And they're noticing how many neighborhoods there aren't any trees. They're noticing how little nature there is and how inequitable the distribution of nature in cities is. So there's going to be more interest in that too. And finally, I think, and I've been talking about this for a long time, long before COVID, and teachers have a real special role to play in this. I've become convinced over time, and I don't know that this is true in Ireland. I know it's true in the United States. But when one asks people what images come into their mind of the far future, right now, don't think about it. What does the far future look like? Almost always the images that people describe are images that look like they're out of Blade Runner or Mad Max, or at best the Hunger Games, or at least there's a few trees. They're post-apocalyptic images. Almost always. Martin Luther King said and demonstrated in many ways that any movement, any culture will fail if it cannot paint a picture of a world that people will want to go to, of a future that people will want to go to. His great speech was not called "I Have a Nightmare." What happens to a culture when the only images that it can conjure up of the future look like Blade Runner and Mad Max? you can just about bet that if we can't imagine it, we're not going to get there. And that what we do imagine is where we'll end up. Teachers, schools have a huge role to help people begin to see different pictures in their mind of what the future looks like. And I make the case that many of the same solutions for biodiversity collapse, climate emergency, and human loneliness, human isolation, many solutions apply to all of those at the same time. When we have more wilderness areas, when we expand our parks for more wilderness, that's good for us too. That's good for biodiversity collapse. It's good for extinctions. When we change our cities into nature-rich environments, that improves our physical health, our mental health. All of these things get better in a future which has nature as an organizing principle in how we live, not just as something over there to be studied or to be used, to be mined. I want to add one more thing to this, and it is one of the themes of the new book. And I hope you'll talk about this in the next few days. Even before COVID, with all the talk about social isolation, science was, the medical community was looking at what was called the epidemic, parallel to COVID, the pandemic of human loneliness, of social isolation. One study in the United States looked at generational loneliness, and they looked from baby boomers, from the greatest generation of baby boomers on down to Generation Z, and they found that the younger people were, the lonelier they felt. We used to think it was older people that were the loneliest. It's flipped. What does that say about a society in which the younger you are, the lonelier you are? A lot of things have been attributed to this epidemic. And by the way, the medical community, the reason they're concerned about this is because human isolation, loneliness, is now associated as much or more with morbidities, early death, as much or more as obesity and smoking. A lot of reasons for that. Not everything can be blamed on Mark Zuckerberg. It's not just the internet. It's the design of cities. People get lectured to take a walk. Walk where? In much of San Diego, if you try to take a walk, you'll be stopped by a freeway. We're not designing cities to encourage that. Or I mentioned stranger danger. All these other issues are moving us indoors and into isolation, away from each other. Believe it or not, in order to have a healthy democracy and a healthy culture, you have to go out the front door. You have to know what's around you. You have to know the place in which you live. I make the case in this new book that, yes, all of those causes that I mentioned and more, the breakup of the extended family, all of those things are the cause for the rise of human loneliness. But there's another one. I think that our loneliness is rooted in something older and deeper, and it's species loneliness. As a species, we are desperate to feel not alone in the universe. Why else would we look for Bigfoot? Why else would we look for intelligent life on other planets when we know it probably might not be a good idea to find it? Because we're desperate to feel that we are not alone. As a species, we have become increasingly alone as we've disconnected from nature. The irony is that we are not alone. Obviously, this has religious implications, to not feel alone in the universe. God keeps many people, gives them a sense of being alone. But the irony is that we're not alone. There is a great conversation going on all around us all the time in that older language that I mentioned. And we can hear it and not realize it. We can tap into it. We can be there if we pay attention. And when we do that, when we recognize the intelligence, and there's more and more science on this, of the animals, as well as the trees that are around us, and the more we have that connection that I mentioned, that habitat of the heart, when we enter that, there is that story I told about the eagles. There was absolutely no way for me to feel lonely in those moments. When we have those connections, there's no loneliness. It goes away. We have to give that to our kids. We have to give that to ourselves. And you all play perhaps the most important role in making sure that happens.
Richard, when you stop talking, it's such a big shock. You've actually inspired so many people, and the comments that are coming in are just fabulous. You know, you've hit people on so many different levels, and even for me, I'm lost when you talk. I'm just completely like, I'm with you all the way, absolutely. And I mean, it's quite a bleak picture of the future in one way that can be painted. I mean, do you think, have we gone too far away? Can we bring people back into nature? Teenagers don't like the discomfort of rain or the insects that might bite, and parents are afraid to bring children outside. Have we gone too far? Can we come back if we all come on board now?
We're seeing that every day. If you go to the True Nature Network, you'll see a lot of good news. People like you are doing great things all over the world. There's great news out there. And I'm a journalist. I'm not a happy news guy just for happy news sake. You know, I look for problems. But I'll tell you, there's great things going all over the country, all over the world, to connect people to nature, and it's happening. And you're doing some of that. But it is never too late. I'll tell you briefly, I was at Purdue University speaking several years ago, and there were some students there that took me to have coffee, and they wanted to talk to me, and they wanted to tell me something. I said, well, okay. So we went to have coffee. The guy over here, sitting there, I think he was a junior in college, whatever, he said, and these were all environmental studies majors. He said that he had tried to join some conservation groups, their local branches, national groups, and he had gone to their meetings, and he came away depressed every time, and he didn't go back. And I said, well, tell me about that. He said, well, for one thing, they all look like you. He said that to me. They're all white and they're all old. Well, thanks, buddy. But he was right. The biggest conservation organization, one of them, I won't name it because I don't like to embarrass them, it's a good group. The biggest conservation organization in the world, or one of them, the average age is 74, the membership. The average, no, I'm sorry, is 76. The average new member is 74. So the old members get together, they haze the incoming new members. That's true. I mean, the conservation has not paid attention to kids anywhere near as much. Now, a lot of them are changing, though. I was pretty tough on in Last Child in the Woods, but a lot of them are doing good things. That was one aspect of it, but that depressing part, that was really important. At that point, a young lady, a young student on the other side of the table, very hip young lady, I know that because she had tattoos. She leaned across the table and she said, all my life I've been told it's too late. And she repeated it. All my life I've been told it's too late. I thought, my God, she's right. What has journalism been saying? What have the environmental organizations been saying? That's the drumbeat. It's either too late or it's almost too late. It may be almost too late, but it's never fully too late. We have to begin to envision a different future than the one we're envisioning. And again, that's where you come in. That's, I think, your most important job. Sorry, my answers are so long.
I'm seeing people clapping on their screens, Joyce. So I think that really takes us to the end of the talk, and I don't even know how to put a full stop on it, because I would sit here for hours more. I really would, listening to you, Richard. It was an honor, and we have such amazing comments that I can't wait to fully read. They're catching my eye as you were speaking. I do want to say that Richard's books are available in Eason's, so you can buy them from easons.com, and they are free shipping. So that's Eason's is an Irish bookstore. They're also available in the Ennis Bookshop, which is a local bookshop, and in Debray's on Shop Street, and debray.ie. They and I'll put all these links in the chat in a moment. Debray.ie have them online as well. And of course, our friend Amazon, and the book depository as well.com. So I urge you to and go out and start your collection. I'd love to just do a quick poll. It's just 2 questions that I'll launch in a minute, just a small bit of feedback. And I want to thank Kate as well for joining me tonight and for being an excellent co-host. And Richard, thank you, and thanks for everything.
No, thank you.
It's been an honor. Yeah. And I'm actually, the other thing I'll put in the chat is a link to the Burn Bio Trust. I'm going to rattle the virtual donations bucket here, but just a link to the Burn Bio Trust, just to our support us, donate page as well. Okay. Thank you, Richard. Thanks.
Thanks. And someday I hope to meet some of you.
Richard.
Thanks.
We hope so too.
Bye-bye.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you, Richard.
Thanks.